It would be incredibly easy to just call The Outer Worlds a scaled down Skyrim or a more focused Fallout and be done with it. But to do that would be an injustice to a spectacular RPG that, well, how to put this delicately, breathes much needed life into this subgenre of games.
We both know why you're here, and that's to talk about the next Fallout.
Many players hoped that last year's Fallout 76 would be the title that scratched the Bethesda open world itch, but its catastrophic failure and inability to please just about anyone meant that fans would have to wait a little longer. For myself and many others, 2015's Fallout 4 was the last time we got to experience this style of game, and yet even that title was very divisive. And for some folk, you have to turn the dial all the way back to Fallout New Vegas in 2010, ironically also developed by Obsidian, to find their last great experience with this subgenre. The nearly decade-long wait for those folks must have been brutal, but thankfully, The Outer Worlds delivers exactly what we were all hoping for, a true player-character-driven RPG that allows you to approach the world, the combat, the quests, and the story however you see fit. But while the gameplay stands strong on its own, certain elements of both the story and the presentation do drag the game down a bit to the point that they're worth acknowledging. And with Bethesda shitting the bed last year, it would be easy to loft this game up, look past all of its flaws, and praise it blindly. But that really wouldn't be giving it its dues. And that's exactly what we're going to do in Return to RPG Roots, my critique of The Outer Worlds. So as with most of my critiques, I like to start with either the gameplay or the story, whichever I feel is more critical to the title, and with The Outer Worlds, gameplay takes the crown. There are 4 pillars that this title's gameplay is held up by, those being combat, exploration, dialogue, and character building, with 3 of those 4 pillars being incredibly durable. So let's start with the strongest. True player-driven RPGs get one thing right from the very beginning. They do not muddle the player character with any sort of background information. For players who truly want to create a role-playing experience for themselves, this allows them to imagine as detailed a backstory for their character as possible, and then they can choose stats and skills that best suit that predetermined playstyle. And I'm so happy to say that The Outer Worlds accomplishes this in spades, as your playable character is just a frozen, forgotten husk from Earth at the game's outset, and plenty of customization options are available to make them exactly who you want them to be. Admittingly, the ability to customize your character's physical appearance is maybe a bit lacking, but to be fair, you'll practically never see their face in-game, so it's not really a big deal. What really stands out as being strong are the 6 stats as well as the numerous skills that you can customize to set your character up for the experience that you want. Strength, dexterity, intelligence, temperament, charm, and perception are your 6 baseline stats, and you can set them all to be anywhere from below average to very much above average. You'll customize all 6 of these stats at the very beginning of the game, and being able to lower certain stats to under their baseline level is brilliant, as it further allows you to create your vision of your character. And the bonus is that by setting a stat to below average and accepting the flaw that comes with it, you earn an extra stat point to put into something else. So for example, if I want to play as a dumbass, I can set my intelligence to below average and then use that extra stat point to put into something else, like charm. Maybe I'm a lovable idiot. Whatever stats you choose for the game will be permanent, but your character is given flexibility to flesh themselves out more with the game's skill sets. There are a bunch of skills to level up, but they are cleverly categorized to make leveling easier. For instance, the melee category contains both your one-handed and two-handed melee stats, while the stealth category contains sneaking, lockpicking, and hacking skills. Upon leveling up, you earn skill points that can be dumped into these broad categories to level up all the skills within them. That is until one or more reach 50 skill points, in which a player must individually choose which stat to level up within that category. So for example, once sneaking, lockpicking, and hacking hit level 50, I then must choose to individually level one of them up instead of all of them at the same time. This is a great point of balance, as baseline skills can be built up early on in the playthrough, while later into the game, you have to pick and choose which skills to level up, which gives your character different strengths and weaknesses. The flexibility in stats and skills means that you can play any way you want. A strong dumbass, a sneaky genius, a brave leader who lets his crew fight for him, or a guy who's just bad at everything, if that's what you're into. And that brings us to the perk system, and it's honestly the weakest part of the character building, as the perks on offer here are pretty generic. There are boosts to health and damage, companion-related perks, carriage capacity stuff, and other boring things you'd expect in a lesser game than this. Don't get me wrong, the perks can be useful, especially on harder playthroughs, but they just aren't very exciting or imaginative, and for a game set in space, it seems like they could have came up with some better ideas that really influenced the dialogue system, and especially the combat system, instead of just having these slight skill tweaks. You earn these perk points for every 2 levels that you accrue, but you can also earn them through one of the major additions that the Outer Worlds brings to this genre, and that would be the flaw system. I hinted at this earlier when I mentioned taking a below average stat at the beginning, but it also takes a mechanical form in the game. If throughout your journey you take, say, an ungodly amount of corrosion damage right to your face, you may be offered a flaw in which you take 25% more corrosion damage, but you get another perk point to use. Players can pick up flaws for a bunch of different things, from fall damage, to insects, to robots, to certain damage types, but again, since the perks aren't that great, especially on easier difficulties, it hardly seems worth accepting any of these flaws. I think that was one of the most disappointing aspects of the game, that the perk system wasn't very imaginative, and it brought down the newly introduced flaw system with it. I hate to end this section on that note though, as I do believe the character creation and role-playing ability in this game to be right up there with the best. But let's move on to combat. Combat can be approached in about 3 ways, either through stealth to avoid it, or by the use of either melee weapons or long-range weapons, aka guns. I've completed 2 playthroughs of the game now and tested out both melee and gun builds and have enjoyed them thoroughly. Going along with my overall thoughts on the game, the gunplay feels refined when compared to games like Fallout 4, as it's not nearly as floaty, which means you don't have to rely on this game's equivalent of VATS quite as much. Guns feel good to control at their baseline, and they can be modified further to handle exactly how you want them to, whether that comes from installing a new scope or reducing its recoil. When combat gets fierce though, the tactical time dilation system serves its purpose nicely. You can slow down time for a brief period and use that window to unload a couple rounds on enemy weak spots that all have different effects. For example, a leg shot may cripple a human, while shooting a beast in the face may blind it. It's supremely helpful when playing on the hardest difficulty, and it's nice to say that for the first time, this VATS-like mechanic doesn't feel like a necessary crutch that you must use to complete the game, but instead, another equally as viable tool to solve the puzzle that is dismembering your foes. Melee combat is also equally as satisfying, but a bit more demanding because of the necessity of getting in close to your enemies. This more frantic playstyle keeps the player more active and can be great fun, especially if you're using one of the 5 rare science weapons spread throughout the game's world. That's right, just like the Wubbajack and other mischief-causing weapons in Skyrim, there's a handful of unique weapons to find that incorporate science into their schematics. Now, I'm not going to spoil them all, but I must admit that using the prismatic hammer was one of the highlights of the game, as it cycles through different damage types with each strike, and also contains the ability to send a plasma charge forward for massive damage.
That's a lot of damage.
I pretty much used it exclusively throughout my second playthrough as a solo anarchist and found it to be full of joyous and bloody moments. But playing alone isn't your only option, as you can discover 6 companions and have 2 of them equipped to your party at all times. More on them as characters later, but mechanically they provide some extra firepower. The highlight of them though is that each has a unique move that you can have them perform on a cooldown for extra damage on enemies. For a standard playthrough, these super attacks serve as not much more than a stylish flair to battle, but it is entirely possible to play as a pacifist who orders companions to do all the damage. If you so choose, you can kind of play more as this commander role where you coordinate how your companions attack, and there's plenty of perks to back up that playstyle. And again, that harkens back to what I was saying in the character building, it's some of the best in video games. And to be real with you, putting those kind of stipulations on yourself, like having all your companions do the damage for you, may be a benefit too, because this game is quite easy, and that's almost something I never complain about. Trust me when I say, play the Outer Worlds on hard mode if you intend to delve deep into the side quests, or else you'll become so overleveled on easier modes. This issue of the normal mode being too easy is only exasperated by the fact that you'll only be facing really a handful of different enemy types for the whole duration of the game. And guess what? There's like 4 species of animals, humans, and 3 types of robots. And that's about it. Once you learn the tactics to beat them, it becomes child's play. So if you intend to dive deep into this game, I would recommend starting it on hard mode. But if you want to do just the main story, normal is okay too. I mean, by all means, play it however you want. It's your playthrough, but that would be my recommendation. Moving on to exploration now, and this is the weakest part of the title when compared to predecessors of this same genre. Games like Fallout 4 and Skyrim have these huge maps with tons of dungeons to explore, many of which are not tied to the main quest or any side quests, but that is not the case in the Outer Worlds. In fact, this isn't just one large open map to free roam around, but instead a series of smaller sections of planets and spaceships that unlock as you progress the main story. When I first saw the planetary map, I was amazed that we'd be visiting what looked like a good 7 or 8 planets, but in actuality, you only end up going to like 5 of them, and 1 is exclusive to the last mission. In fact, on that last mission, you never get to explore that planet, and some of its design in that level is copy-pasted from other sections, which is disappointing. I hate that they dangle so many planets in front of us, yet a bunch of them never unlock or become accessible, and it makes me wonder if they'll be sold as DLC later on, which would be kind of strange because when you finish this game, you cannot continue. The credits roll, and that is it for that character, which means if they release DLC, you're going to have to start a new character and do this huge playthrough to get to where the DLC's at, and it just kind of seems like, why? I want to get the new content. Let me just go back into the world, but they don't let you do that here, and I kind of hate when games do that. Sorry, I ended up going on a rant there, and let me just get back on track and say that some of the planets that you visit here do have multiple locations, but much of the fauna and the flora are the same, so they end up feeling very similar. The planets we do get to explore do a great job of invoking a feeling of being familiar and alien at the same time, but I just wish there was more of them. And on the planets that we do get, there really isn't much to do that isn't tied to a main quest or a side quest. Pretty much all of the explorable dungeons here are gonna be accessed through quests, and so taking time to roam around on your own is pretty much a waste of time. And that's gonna be super disappointing for some people who wanted to get truly lost in the game for hundreds of hours. Not to mention, a lot of the dungeons are notably short and don't take more than a few minutes to complete, with just a few exceptions. So let me be clear now. Do not buy this game if you think that you're going to be able to explore for hours and run up your playtime like in Skyrim. You won't, and you can complete everything here within 35 hours. Now, for me, that was not an issue at all, and it's a big reason I did a second playthrough immediately, but some of you may be turned away by that, and that's alright. Wrapping up this gameplay section now, we come to dialogue, and oh my god, it's so good, guys. It's so well done, it's so well written, and it's so well executed. So many of us were terribly let down when Fallout 4's new and improved handy-dandy dialogue tree was nothing more than an option between 1 to 3 word indicators that failed miserably at indicating exactly what the protagonist was about to wax lyrical about. Here though, we don't have that issue at all, as dialogue is handled wonderfully with full sentences written out in completion for you to choose from. Conversations with NPCs in the Outer Worlds can be just about as long or as short as you want them to be, depending on your playstyle. Now, I'm someone who loves to exhaust dialogue options, and doing so allowed me to learn a ton about the lore of the Outer Worlds and the major players who influenced this place. It also allowed me to learn more about the everyday lives of the people living in the Halcyon colony, which made everything light years more believable. Of course, investing skill points into your speech skills allow you to unlock even more dialogue paths, and you better believe I hit them pretty hard on my first playthrough. I mean, are you trying to gain access to a new area? Use your persuasion skills to talk a person into granting you access. Trying to pilfer that loot you stole for a quest giver? Lie to them and tell them you lost it and keep it for yourself. These additional skill checks to dialogue are nothing new or revolutionary, but they're done here about as well as in any other game. Also, the writing is just so damn good. Characters are given true personalities and backstories, from humble store vendors to major board members. Each of them is fleshed out and feels alive because of the actual written dialogue. You'll be surprised at just how many funny moments come out of the dialogue, whether it's your ship's computer system Ada insinuating a sexual relationship with one of your robot companions, or this company man who stumbles through getting out his company's slogan. And I mean, seriously, look at this slogan. It's not the best choice, it's Spacer's choice. I mean, that is just so perfect, because you can imagine the corporate bigwigs thinking it sounds so good, when in reality, the everyday person interprets it as being exactly what the slogan says. Their stuff is not the best choice. I love it! And there's a good mix of this kind of satire and humor, but also more serious discussions throughout it all, and engaging in dialogue felt just as satisfying, if not more so, than engaging on the battlefield. Gameplay is the king in the Outer Worlds, and it only misses the mark in a few areas. Moving on now, the story of the Outer Worlds is very much deliberately designed for your hero to take center stage, and because it has to be designed around your playstyle and your personality, that means that there are multiple endings based on the choices that you make. There are 3 major endings to the game, 2 of which are practically the same, only made different by who you side with in the end, and the other ending is kind of an Easter egg that can only be accessed through utilizing the flaw system in a particular way. What this all means is that you're not going to find The Last of Us or God of War type storytelling here. Instead, most of the plot is kind of generic in nature, and it's more about the choices you make along the way instead of some grand narrative, which is perfectly fine for a game like this. Essentially, this game's story is more focused on discovering the different factions that make up the Halcyon colony, learning more about them, and then choosing who to side with when they start going after each other with laser guns and shock sticks. Your character, just like in Skyrim, is truly the center of the universe, a mysterious being who shows up and changes destinies and fates. It's not quite as over the top as in Skyrim though, but it's still very apparent. But anyway, quests are designed to get you learning more about the world so that the choices you make in the game are as informed as possible. And the center conflict of the game's narrative lies with the fact that Halcyon is essentially a corpocracy, or a government ran by corporations. Companies like Spacer's Choice, Anti-Cleos, and MSI are all large corporations that are part of a central agency called the Board. The Board controls both all the laws in Halcyon as well as all production of goods, meaning that since they work together, they are able to endlessly profit and get richer and richer without relinquishing any kind of power. It leaves the everyday citizen of the colony completely reliant and poor on these big companies, and that leads to a lot of hostility. It's really the time-old tale of rich versus poor and haves versus have-nots. Ultimately, the main story is about setting you up in a position to either continue the status quo or wreck the whole thing in a whole host of different manners. The overarching narrative really isn't the draw of this game's story though. Most of that comes in the form of your interactions with NPCs, who, as I mentioned earlier, are written fantastically. Nowhere is this more apparent than with the different companions you can find to accompany you on your journey. Each of them has a distinct personality and interesting background, and the companion quests are some of the best that the title has to offer. Now, I don't want to spoil all of them, but I gotta say that Vicar Max was probably my favorite. He was a former prisoner who found the gospel while behind bars, but guess what? He still has a violent streak about him. His aggression paired with his thoughtful comments made for a sort of Jekyll and Hyde effect that I found to be very entertaining. And this kind of praise stems to the other companions as well as faction leaders and other NPCs scattered throughout the planets. Their dialogue trees are the true story of the Outer Worlds, which is all about learning more about this colony that Obsidian has crafted. Really, the only weak part of the story is the villains, because honestly, they're pretty ho-hum. I imagine most players will side with the proverbial good guys in their first playthrough and get the good ending. Without giving away much, in this path, the final villain is very much a snore. First of all, he has a giant robot guarding him, which just feels so generic. And again, it's not a copy and pasted enemy. You haven't seen this enemy before in its entirety, but you've seen things that are very similar, so it just feels like, oh, this is kind of weak. So then you kill the robot and you find the villain, you kill him, and that's it. That's the end of the game. You barely learn anything about him as a villain or his motivations, and he's only introduced maybe 2 hours before the game ends, which means he never gets a chance to be fleshed out or made interesting. He's just the bad guy we have to go kill, so we'd go and do it. That part of the story was its weakest component, but overall, the story holds up because it's all about uncovering the lifestyles of the people living in the colony, and that's what the main quest and side quests deliver. And with that, we reach the last part of this review, and that would be on the presentation, and it's serviceable for the most part. Starting with the graphics, this is by no means the best looking game on console or PC, as I wouldn't call it visually striking in really any way. The environments use a lot of dull colors and there isn't much variety within the landscapes. With that being said though, what's here does a good job of feeling familiar yet alien. The flora and the fauna both blend together and feel like they go hand in hand, and they simultaneously look like living things we're accustomed to while also looking out of this world. Now, what's on display throughout the Outer Worlds isn't bad visually, but it does leave a lot to be desired, especially in today's industry. Again, it would have gone a long way if the other planets on the map were more explorable, and that would have given some variation, but instead we're left without much of that. The music is also not much more than passable, and I can't remember a single track outside of the main menu's theme. Most of it is pretty ambient when you're out exploring, and to be real with you, I can't even remember if it picks up during combat sections. That's how forgettable it was. It serves its basic purpose in terms of creating a little background noise, but not much more than that. However, this game is very much designed to be immersive and doesn't have many over-the-top set pieces, which means that this smaller approach to music is more acceptable. In other words, they weren't really going for grandiose and captivating moments, so it makes sense that the music isn't at that level. Flipping the script though is the voice acting, because it's quite excellent, and I don't believe any characters had repeat voices like you'd sometimes see in games like The Witcher 3. Now, I'm not sure if they reused actors or not, but every character has a unique voice that seems to match their character nicely. I hope that makes sense, you know what I mean? Sometimes in video games you see a character and then you hear their voice and it just doesn't align, it's just off. Like a big biker talking with a high-pitched voice. It isn't right, and it seems like the development studio took extra care to make sure that that was never an issue in the Outer Worlds. But I can't really say the same for facial animations though, as they are pretty inhuman, bordering on the uncanny valley even. It's strange hearing these wonderfully read lines of dialogue with passion and energy and character, only to see it coming from a face that barely emotes. Finally, in terms of performance, I can't really say I ran into any major bugs or glitches or frame rate issues. The only real technical problem that I encountered on my PS4 Pro would be pop-in textures, and this happened quite a bit when loading into big city areas like Edgewater or Stellar Bay. It seems especially bizarre that this issue was so persistent, given that the load times seem to be a bit too long for a game releasing in 2019. They aren't awful, but it is noticeable, especially when you have to leave your ship, which makes you load into the city hub, which then you have to go and load into the wilderness after leaving that city hub. It's time consuming and it's not great, and there's way too much time stuck in loading screens in this game. The only other note to make of this presentation, and I'm throwing it in here at the end because I'm pretty sure it's about to be patched, is that the font is way too small in the menus. It's very hard to read on TV screens and probably even monitors, I imagine, but I'm pretty sure they're fixing that soon, or it may already be fixed at the time of this review. All in all, the presentation was probably the weakest of the three gaming pillars, but it's by no means a deal breaker. Just don't go into it expecting to be blown away with fantastic music or the most incredibly rendered open world you've ever seen. Starting to wrap it up here now, perhaps the best and worst thing that I can say about the Outer Worlds is that it leaves you wanting more. If Fallout 76 disappointed you, and you've been craving a game of this sort for a while, the Outer Worlds will fill that void in your gamer soul. But it won't last quite as long as some of the previous Bethesda-style RPGs. Despite personally wishing it was longer, the Outer Worlds still delivers great value for its $60 price tag, and multiple playthroughs are encouraged through making different choices, big and small, throughout the journey. Most of the game's systems are slight tweaks and upgrades to the standard formula instead of grand sweeping changes, and honestly, that's okay. It delivered exactly what fans of this genre have been wanting, the ability to roleplay as anyone with combat and dialogue options that are plentiful and carry weight to them. The story is also subservient to gameplay, as it's built more around world building than a true focused narrative, and this allows the player to put themselves into the world rather than viewing it as a story through someone else's eyes. And from a presentation standpoint, the game is not much more than average, and it's easily the weakest part of the title. However, the voice acting is so well done, as well as the writing, to mesh it all together, and it makes it work. You know what? Let me just say it plainly. The Outer Worlds is one of the best games I played in 2019, and I would for sure consider giving this as an early Christmas present to someone you love, or even just to yourself. Thank you so much for watching. Please leave a like if you enjoyed the video, consider subscribing for more, follow me on Twitter at NopeNapNarp, and as always, have a nice day, and take care.